In the high-powered world of billion-dollar tech companies, employees think they know their bosses, at least the ones who show up in the public eye. But what if the person you trusted most was standing right in front of you, watching your every move, and you had no idea? John Hamilton, the CEO of Horizon Tech, had grown tired of the game. With his wealth and power, he could manipulate the company from behind closed doors. But now he wanted something different. He wanted to know who his employees really were, without the masks, without the pretensions. And he had a plan to find out. Horizon Tech stood like a pillar of success in the heart of the city, its gleaming glass towers reflecting the morning sun as employees filtered in through its rotating doors. The company was a behemoth in the tech industry, known for its innovative products and cutting-edge technology. The environment was fast-paced, competitive, and cutthroat, a place where only the best survived. Alice Turner, a mid-level manager in the tech department, was one of those who thrived in the chaos. She had started her career at Horizon Tech right out of college, working late nights, making sacrifices, and climbing the ladder. Alice was fiercely ambitious, determined to one day sit in the corner office, the ultimate reward for her years of dedication. But as she poured herself into her work, there was always a lingering question. Was the cost too high? She barely had time for a social life, often leaving the office long after others had gone home. Her desk was a symbol of her dedication, organized but cluttered with stacks of papers, empty coffee cups, and her laptop, constantly open to multiple tabs of code and data. Alice was known for her razor-sharp mind and relentless work ethic, but her coworkers also noticed the pressure weighing on her. She had become a machine, driven only by the desire to succeed. Her personal relationships had suffered, and her health had taken a back seat to her obsession with reaching the top. But she believed it would all pay off. One day she would be recognized for her efforts. Then there was David Clark, the new developer in the office, fresh out of university. David's raw talent and ambition made him an immediate standout. He spent countless hours learning the ropes and impressing everyone with his coding skills. But beneath his hard-working exterior, David was still figuring out his place in the company. He had heard whispers about the CEO, John Hamilton, the billionaire visionary who had built Horizon Tech from the ground up. David knew meeting the CEO was a long shot, but he hoped that with enough hard work, he could one day earn a spot on Hamilton's radar. For now, he was content with quietly making his way up, coding and building what would, in time, become the next breakthrough product. Finally, there was Sophia Brooks, the head of the marketing department. Sophia had been at Horizon Tech for nearly a decade, watching the company rise from a small startup to a global powerhouse. Her sharp mind and cool demeanor had earned her a level of respect that few others in the office could match. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. She had already reached the pinnacle of her career. But Sophia was different from her colleagues. While Alice was driven by ambition and David by youthful hunger, Sophia was pragmatic. She understood that success in this company wasn't just about hard work. It was about timing, connections, and knowing how to play the game. Sophia's office was minimalist, everything arranged with precision. She rarely allowed anyone to see her true emotions, which often led others to label her as cold or distant. But what they didn't know was that Sophia's icy exterior hid a mind constantly at work, calculating her next move. Each of them was struggling with their own version of success. Each had their own reason for wanting to make it in this high-pressure world. But they all had one thing in common. None of them knew that the person they worked for, the billionaire CEO they never interacted with, was standing right among them, observing their every move. John Hamilton had grown tired of the usual corporate games. He wanted to know who his employees really were, behind the polished personas and professional facades. So he devised a plan to test them, not from a boardroom, but from within. Dressed in simple clothes with a baseball cap low over his eyes, John walked through the halls of Horizon Tech, just another face in the crowd. No one knew who he was. No one knew they were being tested. But John had a mission. He wanted to find out who, among the countless employees, truly deserved to lead. As he walked past Alice's desk, John couldn't help but notice her laser focus on her work. He had seen this type of dedication before, but it was always a double-edged sword. Was Alice really committed to the company, or was she simply chasing after the wrong goals? Nearby, David sat hunched over his keyboard, coding feverishly. His determination was evident in every keystroke. John could see the fire in his eyes. He was hungry for success. But how far would David go to achieve his dreams? Was he willing to sacrifice everything for the promise of recognition? And then there was Sophia. Her office was quiet, her decisions sharp and deliberate. John had a particular interest in her. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't trying to prove herself. Sophia was already in control, playing the game with unmatched skill. But what would she do when faced with the truth? Would she manipulate the system, or could she be trusted to lead? As John watched them, he realized the complexity of his experiment. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. He wasn't just observing the employees of Horizon Tech. He was examining what it meant to be successful in a world that often valued results over integrity. Would Alice's ambition cloud her judgment? Would David's hunger lead him to betray others? Would Sophia's cold calculations expose a lack of loyalty? And most importantly, could he, a billionaire CEO who had built this empire, ever truly know who was worth trusting? As John made his way through the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers to these questions would change everything. Sure, here's an expanded section for the rising action of your story, focusing on key interactions, emotional stakes, and the development of tensions. It didn't take long for John Hamilton, disguised as an ordinary employee, to observe the first signs of ambition, and perhaps the cracks in it. Alice Turner sat in her usual spot, her laptop glowing with the latest set of company reports. Her face was tired, but determined. Her goal was clear: rise through the ranks, break through the glass ceiling, and secure her place at the top. She thought she was on the fast track, but little did she know, the path she was walking was much more complicated than she believed. John watched her from behind the partition of a nearby cubicle. He noticed her restless energy as she flicked through spreadsheets. Despite the clear focus in her eyes, there was something else hidden beneath the surface: a quiet desperation. "Hey, Alice, we need those numbers by the end of the day, okay?" a colleague called out, walking by her desk. Alice nodded without looking up, her fingers still dancing across the keyboard. She barely acknowledged the pressure, but John could see it: the strain in her shoulders, the subtle twitch of her eye. She was trying to please everyone, trying to be the perfect employee. As the day wore on, John casually observed how Alice was not only juggling her own workload, but also picking up tasks for others. Her colleagues asked her for help, assuming that, because she was always around, she had nothing better to do. The more she helped, the more she became the unsung hero, the one who always stepped in, but never got the recognition she deserved. John noticed it was a pattern. Alice worked tirelessly, but received little acknowledgement from her team. John had designed this test not just to observe their productivity, but to see how his employees interacted with others under pressure. How far would Alice go to prove her worth? At the end of the day, Alice stayed late again, as always, finishing reports and assisting her colleagues with last-minute changes. As she packed up, John decided to make his first move. "Alice, right?" he said, walking up to her desk. She looked up, momentarily startled. John was a tall man, dressed simply, with a baseball cap pulled low. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but Alice could tell he wasn't an ordinary employee. "Yeah, I'm Alice," she said, offering a polite, professional smile. "How can I help you?" "I'm new here," John said, offering her a smile that seemed a little too friendly for someone she didn't recognize. "I've been noticing how much you've been working. You really seem to go the extra mile. But let me ask you something." Alice's curiosity piqued. She'd worked so hard for recognition, and someone noticing her efforts was a rare occurrence. "Go ahead. Is it worth it?" John asked, his voice low yet probing. "All this effort? Do you really get what you deserve?" Alice blinked, surprised by the question. It wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a challenge. She thought for a moment, looking at her computer screen. "Of course," she said, though there was a hesitation in her voice. "I work hard because I want to move up. Everyone knows that. The company values people who are committed, who put in the hours." John leaned in slightly, his eyes studying her every move. "Does it feel like you're getting ahead? Or do you feel like you're just filling in for everyone else, doing the work they don't want to do? The question struck her harder than she expected. It felt like a mirror was being held up to her, a reflection of what she had been hiding from herself. She was giving everything to a company that barely noticed her sacrifices. Well, Alice started, her words trailing off. She wasn't sure how to answer. You deserve more than this, John said quietly, his voice oddly compassionate. You don't need to be a martyr for this company. Alice looked at him, her mind racing. Who was this person to make such assumptions about her life? But there was a sincerity in his eyes that made her pause. Thank you, but I'm fine, she said stiffly, suddenly feeling defensive. I do this because it matters. John didn't push further. He smiled, nodded, and left her to her thoughts. But the seed had been planted. As Alice sat alone in the dim office, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had been working so hard for so long, but she hadn't really stopped to ask herself why. Had she been blindly following a path that would only leave her empty? The tension in her chest grew as she realized she was facing a crossroads. David Clark had always been the first to jump into any new project. He was eager, driven, and ready to prove himself in any way possible. But lately he had started to feel the weight of his ambitions. Working late into the night, his eyes bleary from staring at the screen for hours, David began to question whether he was really achieving what he wanted. Sure, he was impressing his boss with his code, but at what cost? He was sacrificing sleep, food, and any form of personal life. One evening, as he was working through a particularly complex coding problem, he overheard two colleagues chatting. It's tough working under David, isn't it? One of them said. The other laughed. Yeah, he's always the first to volunteer for extra work, always coding nonstop. But it's like he has no boundaries. People are starting to notice. David paused, unsure if he had heard them correctly. The two were referring to his own work habits. The whispers hurt more than he cared to admit. Was he working himself into the ground, trying to prove his worth, while alienating everyone around him? As the conversation continued, David realized that his need to be seen as irreplaceable might be pushing him to extremes. The truth was that he wasn't just working to prove his worth to his bosses. He was doing it to compensate for a lack of self-confidence. But there was a price to pay. That night, as David sat staring at his computer screen, John Hamilton walked by his desk, just another anonymous employee in the sea of workers. But David noticed him. There was something about the man, something oddly familiar. Hey, David called out, looking up from his screen. You're new here, right? John turned and smiled faintly. Yeah, just getting started. Seems like you've got a lot on your plate, he said, glancing at David's screen filled with complex code. David shrugged. Yeah, always a lot to do around here. I'm just trying to keep up. He gave a forced laugh, but inside his mind was swirling with doubts. You know, John said, pausing, I see you working all the time. You never stop, do you? He studied David carefully, his words seemingly innocent, but David felt the weight behind them. Do you think it's enough? David froze. What do you mean? John smiled, the hint of a challenge in his expression. I'm just wondering if you're doing it for yourself or because you're trying to impress everyone else. David swallowed hard. No one had ever asked him that before. He was so focused on climbing the ladder that he had never stopped to ask himself why he was doing it. Was he working himself to exhaustion to get ahead, or was it something deeper, something tied to his own insecurities? John's words hung in the air like an invisible weight. David didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, his thoughts racing as John moved on. The next day, David woke up feeling drained, physically, emotionally, and mentally. He had pushed himself too hard for too long, and now the consequences were becoming clear. He had been so eager to impress his bosses that he had neglected everything else in his life. His friendships, his health, even his dreams had become secondary to the pursuit of success. David realized that something had to change. But was it too late? And how could he break free from this cycle? Sophia Brooks had always been seen as a mastermind at Horizon Tech, respected for her cold and calculated decision-making. She was a woman of few words, and even fewer people ever got close to her. But she didn't mind. She had built her career on efficiency, and in this business, efficiency was all that mattered. But recently, Sophia had begun to question the cost of her success. The pressure to be perfect, to always make the right decisions, was beginning to take its toll. There were nights when she lay awake, wondering if the sacrifices had been worth it. Was she sacrificing too much of herself to climb the ladder? Would anyone even notice if she stepped back for a moment? One afternoon, as she reviewed some marketing strategies for a new product launch, John Hamilton passed by her office. The familiar face caught her attention. Something about him seemed off. He wasn't wearing the usual corporate attire, and he didn't seem like a senior employee. She watched him for a moment, curious about why someone like him was walking the halls. But it wasn't until she saw him talking to Alice that something caught her eye. There was a subtle tension in Alice's posture, a change in the way she carried herself after the conversation. Sophia felt a flicker of something she rarely experienced: doubt. What was it about this man that made Alice act differently? Why was he asking such pointed questions? The next day, she decided to investigate. She cornered Alice in the break room and casually asked, "Who was that guy you were talking to yesterday?" Alice hesitated, then shrugged. "Oh, just a new guy. He had some questions. No big deal." Sophia studied her for a moment. There was something off about Alice's response. "Is that so? You seemed a bit rattled." Alice stiffened. "I'm fine. It's just that sometimes people ask things that make you think." Sophia nodded, sensing that Alice wasn't telling the whole truth, but she let it go. Still, the encounter had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. She realized she wasn't the only one keeping a sharp eye on everyone else. She had always thought she was untouchable, but now she was questioning if she had underestimated the people around her, and the man who had begun to watch them all. Sophia didn't know it yet, but she was being tested too. And soon the test would hit closer to home than she could have ever imagined. The days had turned into weeks, and the tests John Hamilton had set in motion were starting to unravel the very fabric of Horizon Tech. What had started as a quiet observation was now reaching a breaking point, where decisions had consequences and actions were about to have irreversible outcomes. The employees, Alice, David, and Sophia, were beginning to feel the weight of John's unseen presence. The stress had started to mount for each of them. Alice's sleepless nights, David's emotional exhaustion, and Sophia's growing doubt all collided in a moment that no one could predict. John, still disguised as an ordinary employee, had been watching them closely, learning more than he ever anticipated. But now, as the tension reached its peak, he realized that the lines between observer and participant were beginning to blur. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the pressure at Horizon Tech had never been greater. Alice sat at her desk, her hands trembling as she typed the final numbers into the project report. Her mind raced with thoughts of what John had asked her. Is it worth it? The question lingered in her mind like a shadow. Was all this sacrifice truly worth the elusive goal of promotion? She had been giving everything, her time, her energy, her soul, to a company that barely acknowledged her existence beyond her performance. Her personal life had withered, and her relationships had crumbled under the weight of her ambition. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. She was so close to her goal, she couldn't afford to stop now. She glanced over at David, who was sitting a few desks away, deep in his work. He had become the embodiment of what she wished to achieve: relentless, ambitious, driven by an inner fire. But John's words to her came back, ringing louder now. Was she just another cog in the machine, or was she something more? Her phone buzzed on her desk. It was a text from her manager. "The CEO wants to meet with you about the new project. Now." A cold chill ran through Alice's spine. The CEO? She had never been directly summoned by John Hamilton before. This was it, the moment that could either make or break her career. She had prepared for this moment her whole life. With a deep breath, Alice grabbed her things and walked toward the executive floor. As she approached the elevator, she caught a glimpse of John Hamilton, standing at the far corner, disguised as just another employee, a strange look on his face. He wasn't looking at her, but there was something about the way he stood, the way his eyes seemed to observe her. "Good luck," the elevator operator said as the door slid open, pulling Alice from her thoughts. As she ascended, her pulse quickened. She was about to face the man she had long admired from afar, the one she had been working her entire life to impress. David sat in the small break room, his eyes glassy from lack of sleep. His fingers hovered over his phone, but he couldn't bring himself to respond to his messages. The workload had become unbearable. He had been so focused on impressing John Hamilton that he hadn't stopped to notice the people around him, his colleagues, his friends, who had begun to distance themselves. They saw his exhaustion, his obsession with success. David, feeling the weight of his decision, realized that he couldn't continue living a lie. Alice, caught between her ambition and her doubts, knew she was at a crossroads. And Sophia, ever the strategist, was torn between her cold calculations and the growing desire for authenticity. In the final moments, John revealed himself to them, not as a faceless employee, but as the very man they had all been working for. The shock on their faces was palpable. Betrayal, confusion, and a deep sense of realization flooded the room. They had been tested, watched, and manipulated from the start. "I've been observing you all," John said, his voice firm yet not without empathy. "And I wanted to know who you really were when the stakes were high. What kind of person would you become when pushed to your limits?" The silence that followed was deafening. Each of them had to face the consequences of their actions, their decisions. The company they had fought so hard for, the dreams they had pursued, what had it all been for? John's eyes softened. "The question now is, what will you do next?" The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their lives had changed forever. The revelation of John Hamilton's true identity shook Alice, David, and Sophia to their cores. For weeks they had been unknowingly tested, their ambitions, insecurities, and character revealed in ways they hadn't expected. Each one faced the harsh truth about themselves, their motivations, their sacrifices, and the cost of their blind pursuit of success. Alice, once consumed by ambition, took a step back and reevaluated her priorities. She found balance, realizing that success wasn't worth losing herself. David, having hit rock bottom, learned that true success came not from proving others wrong, but from finding peace within himself. And Sophia, who had built walls around her heart, finally understood that leadership required vulnerability and connection, not just cold calculations. As they moved forward, the trio transformed. They began to understand that ambition, when unchecked, could lead to emptiness, but authenticity and integrity led to true fulfillment. John, having witnessed their growth, stepped aside, leaving them to make their own choices. The company they worked for would thrive, but it would be built on a foundation of trust, collaboration, and self-awareness. The true lesson was clear. Success without integrity is hollow, but a life lived with authenticity and balance is the greatest achievement of all. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this emotional story, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts about the story.